Hello, everyone, and welcome to a workshop overview relating to research methodology, and this workshop will be around qualitative research, an overview of qualitative research from Re-Phew Consulting. And this workshop will have a few objectives. Um, the one of the So by the end of this particular workshop, or this particular session, uh, um, on through this Re-Phew consulting workshop, you should be able to understand the basis of qualitative research, um, basically the sort of underpinnings of qualitative research, understand the process of constructing research questions in relating to collecting qualitative research data, and data collection, and also acknowledge the main features in developing qualitative research. Uh, so there are four main processes that sort of make up the research process, the research process in aligning to qualitative research, and that is um, the initial focus and stage should be about preparing and preparation of qualitative research, and that in itself can be quite extensive, depending upon the research question and what is being investigated. The next aspect is then being able to sort of understand the research question from a participant and investigator or researcher perspective, and in line with that, how both may interact with the research question and aims and objectives differently. And then the third part of the research process aligned to qualitative research is being able to reflect on different aspects that align to qualitative research, specific aims and objectives, again the research question, and also being able to reflect to understand what is required for the qualitative research to be successful in relating to and in regards to peer review, and also understanding how reflection ultimately can help prompt contribution to a given topic or subject entity. Now, another part of the research process, at least relating to qualitative research, is expression, and what that means is being able to sort of understand how the research that's being conducted, how that can be expressed. So, for example, for some researchers and investigators, it might be that having at the end of research or research that's being conducted, in particular, for example, around healthcare research, it could be that having for example, the work shared along with peers and other investigators that are within the around in and around a specific focus around different aspects that align to that research, as one way that the lead investigator can express the context and share, for example, the data that has been collected through that research. And then another way might be to have work documented in a peer review publication, for example. So expression is part of in some regard in relating to the expression or sharing that understanding, but also being able to highlight what's been done in different ways, and how that work can lead into other areas of healthcare practices, for example. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a part of the preparations stage, preparation stages, or the research focus. Now, this the preparation stage, as sort of alluded to, that actually has a focus where for example, the communication, being able to communicate an issue or based on a topic, or a group of topics, for example. They The preparation focus should be about being able to develop, for example, a research question that should and could be explored, and for example needs to be sort of understood from more around an academic context, more in relating to an academic context than any other context. Because, for example, when context is when research is prepared from an academic context, then it stands to it stands to and should contribute to the knowledge that has retrospectively been published around a given around that same topic, from other authors or researchers. So the preparation focus should relate to being able to prepare different aspects that relate to that, or regard around that research, and being able to hone in on the research, having after developing some of the some of the main questions that relate to that topic. So communication, being able to communicate an issue or based on a topic, should be part of the preparation process, and the main research focus. The next thing here is to highlight around sort of compelling sub focuses. So a couple of bullet points here to consider are in relating to this, is that it may change considering further research. So, for example, if there are investigators from academic and health backgrounds, for example, they will be looking at research with quite a bit of foresight, understanding sort of trajectories and patterns in relating to how a research is going to develop, but also how it may, it's also important to understand that a research question that is novel or original, also how that original research question integrates with retrospective research that has also been done, adding new perspective and adding a new sort of understanding how the novelty should be focused into existing research that relates to that topic or subject, or categories. Another point here to make is how, in relating to compelling a subfocus, it may change how it may change considering actual interviews that have been conducted or research interviews that have been conducted. So, for example, it's in one way it's unusual, but in another way it might be completely it might be sort of something that researchers and investigators consider after a research question has been developed. So, for example, only when research interviews have been conducted that a research question and the aims and aspects that are relate to the topic may change after or adapt after the changes after research interview questions have been conducted. So those are some focuses that need to be sort of considered. And then another aspect that relates to the preparation is being able to consult with the literature. So a couple of points around this include to help narrow and sharpen focus. So that might be that with research with research questions, questions can be both narrow or broad related research question. If it's and either way, with either of those aspects, the researcher and investigators can have sub questions that relate to to relate to the research questions, so that it broadens the research question to ensure that, for example, when looking to involve certain groups of participants, that they actually involve involve participants from different perspectives to actually help answer questions. In retrospectively, researchers should delve into the literature to see what's been conducted in relating to similar research questions. Then there's another point here is to help generate specific interview questions. So in some contexts, a researcher and investigator may know the questions that they want to ask on research questions that relate to practice around healthcare, let's say, for example. But in order to ensure there is transparency and integrating what's been conducted, what's been sort of published in peer review journals, for example, it's important for researchers and investigators to delve back into the literature to kind of hone in on some of the specific interview research interview questions. So that way, potentially and hopefully, new added research can be developed and shared in peer amongst those who are doing research in the same or the developing in the same or developing uh, 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 sort of area of healthcare, let's say. Now, the third and final point here I want to make around this is to help with eventual analysis of data gathered. So what this means is that once research interview questions have been conducted, for example, then it's being able to being able to overall put an understanding of what the data sort of highlights and sort of jumps out with after the analysis has been done. So what are some of the conclusions or recommendations, etc., that come out of the research and looking into the literature as well, because the preparation focus doesn't mean to say that researchers and investigators cannot sort of have some baseline understandings of what the data may potentially show and have sort of and have, but doing that, having that understanding should be part of the preparation phase, as well as the research, as well as the research continues in at least aspects of healthcare, because healthcare from let's say, for example, one particular time point to another time point may not necessarily change all that much, but at the same time, parts of of that process, parts of the findings would be different, may well be different, but it relates to how the research links and integrates what has already been conducted by those who have done similar research as well. So it's being able to, the preparation and the research focus initially should, relating to this particular bullet point, is to ensure that there's the analysis can bring out sort of unbiased perspectives in the main, but also have bring out an overview of what the whole research is aligns to with literature that has similar research. So another part of the preparation phase is also, at least where qualitative research is concerned, is that most qualitative research has some form of non-random sampling. So there's random sampling and there's non-random sampling, but either way, as part of the preparation phase, researchers and investigators should know who sort of the kinds of participants that they envisage being part of their of that research. So, for example, in the preparation phase and determining the samples, the kind of participants that are envisaged as part of qualitative data collection, is researchers and investigators should be asking, so number one, who, number two, how many, and number three, how the researcher is going to choose or select or have those researchers, those participants involved. So most qualitative research has that basis across areas of as part of determining the sample and sample size as well, because different depending on the research question, there will be a different amount of participants that could be involved as part of answering specific questions around a main research question. And in healthcare research specifically, it can be quite challenging because no matter whether it's, for example, patients, if there's patients or there's health professionals, either way, it can be challenging if researchers and investigators are sort of foreign to that topic. In context, it's important that researchers are prepared, investigators and researchers are prepared to get are prepared to the extent where they can sort of plan ahead in relating to recruiting for recruiting participants as part of the research questions that are going to be asked. So the next point I want to make around preparation as well is the design instrument. And basically in this context, a successful interview or research interviews requires two main things. Number one is being able to design research questions that kind of prompt or encourage the researcher and investigators to immerse themselves in being in the moment of the interview itself. And obviously there are researchers and investigators, no matter no matter sort of what focus they relate their research around, for example, can easily prompt a research bias as well, and a reporting bias. So a successful researcher investigator has to design research questions that they immerse themselves in and being in the moment or part of the moment of the interview itself, but actually at the same time being detracted. So what this means is that they separate themselves, and I'm going to use this terminology, which will sound quite off, but almost sever themselves off, so that they actually don't so that they don't prompt a research bias, so that when it comes to analysis or putting the results and analysis of research, that their points don't sort of get mixed up with the participants who have contributed to the research. So it's important that they have that that is considered as part of the design of qualitative research questions, qualitative research. And then the second point here is being aware that this can that again that can that this can bring on and prompt a researcher and participant biases. Now, what this also means is that whilst I've said that, for example, the researcher can bring in their own biases, participants may participants can and may have their own biases as well. So, for example, if researchers and investigators are looking to have participants involved in and around a particular area of healthcare, let's say, for example, and those participants have specific, for example, ill health around that particular research question or topic, for example, then accordingly they may have their own biases when it comes to answering specific research questions. So in this context, the investigator and a good investigator and a good researcher will actually be able to kind of separate out and report, so there's a kind of a measured and balanced perspective on that particular research question overall, so thus that when research is published, for example, or looks to get published, then the research then those who have, for example, have already contributed knowledge in that area of and that around that topic, for example, that the views that whether they have or have read about, for example, in research that is in journals, for example, that that the perspective and understanding is a balanced is balanced to an extent that there are limited a limited or a little amount a limited research biases from both from a research perspective and from a participant perspective. So it's important. I've said in a previous workshop, a Re-Phew consulting workshop, there has been an understanding where I have mentioned, for example, some researchers who develop a research question, for example, they can look to involve for example, a ghost interviewer or facilitator, or a facilitator that can ask research questions on behalf of the researcher or investigator, so that again it detracts and separates the researcher from the research question. In particular, it's important to know that everyone in research has research biases, and everyone will have there can be participant biases as well. So it's important to understand this. And in order to collect good qualitative research, and the data collection process to be successful, it's important to understand that rich data or rich data collection can only be sought if the investigator or researcher immerses themselves in the participants' world, and also in some contexts it should work the other way. The participants should try to immerse themselves from the researcher or investigator perspective to try and understand for example, what does the researcher want and what does the researcher what do they what do they want me to say, but what is it also that they are looking, what sort of answers are they looking for, but without sort of knowing researchers in the first place. And in this context, part of the preparation is not just for the researcher but also for participants as well. So here I'm now going to talk a little bit about the interactivity and gaining access. So in this context, in research, and especially around healthcare research, what this means is trying to navigate research in a way that you can actually sort of plan ahead as to where participants are going to be recruited from. So, for example, in healthcare, if it's around a specific research question is around a specific area around healthcare, and the participants are at different, let's say, for example, different hospital sites, or even in and around different, for example, different social media platforms, for example, those who are those, for example, who have are looking to get more understanding around lived experiences of those around a particular healthcare condition, whether on social media or a social media platform, or in a hospital site or at hospital sites. The interactivity and gaining access is an important part, because what this means is because participants, for example, if, for example, participants have serious health issues, for example, and those participants are involved, have to be approached, or are looking to be approached by healthcare coordinators or clinicians to be involved in specific clinical trials or healthcare clinical trials, then those participants cannot really be approached from a research perspective in some context, because what it means is that most of the time participants will end up having to be in clinical trials, which takes a lot of that participant's time, so they cannot be involved in a clinical trial and other research. So that can complicate some aspects, and so the access to having participants involved is hard. It can be harder than it seems, because it's knowing how to. The researcher and investigator needs to know how they can approach these people, and these people who are with serious health conditions, and may be involved in clinical trials. If there's if there's limitations around that, then obviously some aspects of the research question may have to be adapted differently. But it's important to know, researchers should know, or try to identify who they can approach to get participants involved, and that might mean navigating different aspects of healthcare in order to find the appropriate whether academic lead or clinical leads, for example, to involve research, to involve participants in approaching a way to get questions answered around particular aims and objectives. So though it might seem harder than it seems, having an early start on understanding around this then can help the investigator and researcher to have that initial contact, and in one way or another, there's always a footing into the doorway, but it's also trying to know how that can be approached. So that's the initial contact. And then another point here about gaining access is negotiating levels of access. So basically, as I mentioned, there may be, for example, clinical leads, there may be research leads, there may be, for example, organization leads, and in relating to social media platforms, there may be social media platform leads, like, for example, moderators or admins of those sort of social media platforms, who can be approached, for example. So negotiating levels of access is important, and by taking the steps early and doing this, then actually it takes a huge amount of sort of it takes a lot of pressure away earlier, rather than later, especially around where topics can get intricate quite quickly, and in healthcare, that's in relating to healthcare research, that's more challenging than anything else in some contexts. So it's also in relating to negotiating levels of access, etc. There's also knowing again who the gatekeepers are, knowing more about knowing whether there may be a reason, for example, to have to approach stakeholders, and to also approach sponsors or whoever around in part of developing part of developing research around healthcare, but also knowing that gaining access then, or part of the gaining access may require lots of different sort of figureheads or level or players or those leads, and knowing how to approach them. That also allows whether positively or negatively, it allows the researcher and investigator to actually to also actually build a network, and that's also important as part of the research process. And in healthcare, the network, a network can be those in lots of different sort of areas. It could be across in and around healthcare, academia, and industry. It can work. It can work in. It can work in lots of different ways for the researcher and investigator, at least where healthcare research topics are concerned. Um, Now, apart from this, or with this, gaining access should be about developing trust and rapport. So, what this means is that, for example, if researchers and investigators and investigators, for example, initially are unsuccessful in trying to identify and identify sort of participants or research participants to help answer specific questions around around a main research question. um, what should happen is that if they're not able to gain access, for example, then the process should allow that others that know of that researcher or investigator, they can be that to an extent that that researcher or investigator can be signposted. So it becomes almost a responsibility of the first and second, maybe third, fourth, or fifth, or sixth, or whoever number of individuals or teams or organizations that that researcher or investigator has approached initially, and then it becomes those other people's responsibility to also try and signpost the investigator or researcher to participants in one way or another. And in doing so, the researcher and the researcher investigator and those people that have been approached, there should be a trust developed and a rapport developed. And in academia and academia research versus, for example, in academia research versus industry research, let's say, for example, that process or that process can take time, and it's arduous as well, because the researchers, clinical leads, or healthcare leads in who healthcare leads who also have involvement around academia as well, have to ensure or have to ensure or should be approaching research from an academic perspective, and that can be quite sort of a challenging and arduous process. So it's important to get to have that understanding. So gaining access can be challenging, but once the researcher investigator sort of knows what has managed to gain access, then developing trust and rapport should be viable. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about interactivity, but from a collecting data or data collection perspective. So first and foremost is being able to observe and look. And what this means in context is information is can be, or is a difference, is a difference that makes a difference. So in some context, after or during data collecting, collecting data around qualitative research data, researchers, investigators, when, for example, they got, let's say, for example, there's a transcript in front of them relating to the research that's been done, then basically, what is the data saying? What is the analysis, or what are the results of the research? What sort of jumps out at them? And now, in this context, where qualitative research is concerned, it is very challenging to have and every researcher and investigator, whether they're novice, whether they're experts or whatever level, will always have this challenge where, for example, even when there's a transcript in front of them around after conducting research interviews, for example, the data may the data collection will highlight what needs to be said, or what should be said in one way, but it may it might be different. The information and the data collection may tell a different story, for example. So researchers, in a way, even after collecting the data, based on the research questions that have been propagated and asked, for example, an investigator has to take a step back and have a look at the transcripts and what is the research saying, what sort of jumps out. So information in this context is a difference that makes a difference. So being able to report is part of the is part of the observing process. So then the researcher and investigator has to ask questions, and that requires them to sort of listen in a way that they can understand the questions that have been asked, but also plan and potentially plan for sort of unplanned follow-ups. So what this means is that basically, where if there's data collection that has been sought as part of a main research question with aims and objectives, etc. initially, it may require a researcher and investigator to have planned more planned or unplanned follow-ups with participants, for example, so that they can get more out of the data. And in this context, it can be one of two things. So either that the researcher investigator didn't ask the questions that they wanted to ask, but the data collection process was not rich enough initially. So they may have to plan and have unplanned sort of follow-ups to get more out of particular participants, for example, or for example, have more interviews, research interviews. So it's being able to, so again, observe first, and then sort of listen to what's been answered and how the questions have been answered, and then it's important as part of this the sort of interactivity process and the data collection process that researchers, investigators continue to take notes as well. So being able to be descriptive, having descriptive notes, having analytical notes and connections to consider. So how the analysis connects with literature that's been published around the same area, for example, or research sort of inquiry, and then also to think about additional questions that might need to be considered. So what comes out of the data after identifying sort of understanding from the transcripts, for example, the transcript from following interview questions and research interview questions, and how an investigator will look should consider what other questions can come out of that data for potentially more follow-up research for example, so it's in understand qualitative data collection generally is more can be more intricate than quantitative data collection, but um, uh, ultimately is ensuring that there's a sort of a process that brings in integrity to the sort of data collection that has taken place. So being analytical, being descriptive is part of qualitative research generally. Um, the next thing I want to sort of highlight is about being expressive. Qualitative research, in a way, in some contexts, can be quite arduous, and any qualitative researcher will know that. And so in the beginning, or even part even as whether part of the qualitative research journey, or in preparing qualitative research, is also it's always important to be expressive, or have an expression in some context to integrate what the investigator and researcher is looking to identify, is looking to answer in relating to a particular research question. So in order to do this, in order to be expressive, and in order to have an expression, is being able to learn from journal articles that you read as well. So for example, if, for example, the specific journal articles in a particular peer-reviewed journal, for example, having a balanced view around the subject entity is important, because again, when researchers do research and get get research published, the journal articles that they read can also lead to having a research bias. So it's important, again, to have a measured understanding and link that and integrate that with a balanced view when it comes to actually conducting research. And in this context, is being expressed, having an expression, and being expressive. And in this context, qualitative research is, in this context at least, is different. It differs quite a lot from quantitative research, because quantitative research does not require as much expression, because of the numerical perspectives around quantitative research, versus qualitative research, which requires investigators and researchers to have sort of a foresight in some way, but also knowing what's in literature. So I would say to all those listening to this particular Re-Phew consulting workshop, to know that it's important to read around the literature and know what's sort of out there around the particular research question. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit here about creating a good interview guide, or a topic guide, some would refer to, and that is to say that all research, or point one here is, all research starts with good questions, and point two, good overall questions that focus a project are key, but so are specific interview questions you may ask participants. So when developing an interview guide or topic guide, the process or the preparation of developing a topic guide or an interview guide may well be very biased from the beginning, and that is why it's important to know and involve those participants in some regard, who would be appropriate to ask these questions, to find out if these are the questions that they will be, or that they don't mind answering. So for example, there could be in healthcare research, for example, questions can be very sensitive very quickly. So it's important for investigators and researchers to know that the questions that they ask are questions that participants are willing to answer, but also know that after an initial phase, it may well be that the questions will need to be adapted in another way. And what from an in an academic world, in an academic perspective, research questions that are developed have to go through an ethics application process in order to ensure that the questions are not too, for example, intimidating, or where, for example, where researchers and participants, for example, may have indifferences to an extent where where participants don't want to answer the question, and they may drop out or withdraw or may withdraw from answering particular research questions. So it's important to know that research interview questions should be propagated in a way that researchers and participants enjoy the experience, and again, where qualitative research is concerned, both participants and the investigator should know and enjoy the context and understanding around particular research questions, and a good investigator and researcher will know how to make research or intriguing for both, from both perspectives. So I wanted to just give this overview around creating a good topic guide or an interview guide. So the next thing I want to talk about or highlight relates to the previous point around developing good research questions. But asking good questions should also be interpretive as well. So a couple of points here. At its best, the qualitative interview is an event in which one person, the investigator, the researcher, or the interviewer, encourages others to freely articulate interests and experience, or their intrigues and experiences. So that what this means is that good research questions, and I will make this point a little bit later, should be sort of open-ended. So what this means is that a researcher should allow and encourage the participants to answer a question as freely and as openly as they would like to. So part of this also means that in the run-up to developing a topic guide. For example, the researcher will have should have should prepare or have preparation um, um, in part of the process, so that they know that all the research questions that are being asked or will be propagated should be in one context, should be not just open-ended, but also should be enjoyable for both the participant to answer those questions, but also where the researcher is asking those questions. So again, being interpretive is important as part of the process. And the second point here is to say that its ability to travel deeply and broadly into subjective realities has made the interview a preeminent method in communication and nearly all qualitative research. So basically here, all researchers and investigators sort of should know that a good qualitative research generally should allow both the investigator and participants not just to enjoy the understanding and the experience around particular research questions, but also allow the participants to almost liberate themselves or feel liberated when they've answered a question. So that in context, what that means is being able to travel deeply into research questions so that they can be answered and ultimately can be reported to colleagues or peers and those who are reviewing the subject, so that they know that the question that originally was developed to be answered has been answered expressively and in a way where participants have answered to the best of their ability in the time in around the time the research questions were being asked. So for example, research interviews or qualitative research interviews can take anything up to from for example 15 minutes up to 40 or 45 minutes, for example, depending on how many questions are being asked. So it's important again for both the participants and the researchers to be able to kind of delve in deeply into the subjective realities around a particular research question or research questions. And I want to highlight a few more points relating to sort of research questions and what they should sort of encourage. So point one here is for the investigator and the researcher to ask questions that are relevant ask relevant biographical questions to help contextualize information. So when research questions are being asked, for example, rich data is only as good as the researcher being able to contextualize the understanding with existing literature or literature that is around that subject entity. And And researchers, generally speaking, qualitative researchers at least, kind of have to should be looking at literature to help contextualize, because if it's not contextualized by references or by referencing or citing, for example, then the researcher is actually not uh, uh, is not conforming to sort of academic rule, at least around in context with healthcare research, let's say, for example, which requires investigators and researchers to actually be able to cite and reference according to particular knowledge around a particular subject entity. So, for example, if there's data that's been collected around a particular research question, then that research question should the investigator and researcher should be able to link that research, the answers around that particular research question, to literature that's been published in the same in and around the same topic. The next point I want to make here is that some questions should allow a respondent or the participants to tell his or her own story. And again, having those research questions as part of the preparation phase and the initial phases, having them open-ended should allow participants and respondents to tell their own story, or give their own perspective in a safe in a safe and in a safe and in a way where they do not feel that they are hindered, for example. Now, another point I want to make here is that open questions are better than closed questions, and you don't have to be a genius to work that out, because when questions are open or open-ended questions, then again the participants, and this is participants, whichever question is being asked and whichever area and focus that a researcher or investigator is looking to have questions answered, participants are more likely to be truthful and more sort of liberated around giving responses or providing responses based on open-ended questions, rather than those that are closed questions. And then another point I want to make here is that that's important to prepare and use an interview guides or topic guides to assist in this process. And I've mentioned about how a little bit the importance of developing that those research questions as part of a topic guide or an interview guide early on. And in the early phases, generally speaking, and I'm just highlighting this in this workshop because generally researchers, every investigator in the initial phases, when they're developing research questions or a topic guide for research interviews for different participants. Generally speaking, they will have they will have research biases in the beginning, but then as the researcher investigator does more literature reviewing, or understands what's been said in the literature in some context, but also understands how there is an area in healthcare, let's say again, for example, that research has not answered, then generally speaking, the research questions can develop further develop further, so that the understanding around a particular research question are actually are well informed. And those are the main points here, really, that the interview guide or the topic guide has to be well informed. So I'm just going to highlight some main points relating to how interview questions or research questions should be sort of chronological. So, for example, the first point is that you have open questions, for example, that are icebreakers, easy to answer, so they're not too intimidated for the researcher or investigator to ask, and also not too intimidating for the participant or the respondent to answer. So having those open questions are important in the beginning. And then introductory questions, for example, should be about addressing a particular topic and setting the scene, setting the context, setting the understanding, for example, why the research is being conducted. And as part of this process, for example, or part of these questions, the researcher or investigator can, for example, say to the participants who have been recruited for the research, or the respondents, for example, whether they had taken time to read, for example, information sheets before signing a consent to be part of that research, for example. So researchers should make that part of their introductions in addressing a particular research question or research topic. Then there's the point I want to make around the transition questions. So the transition questions should be about move into key questions and threatening issues. So, for example, where participants or where respondents, for example, feel that there are challenges or where there are issues, or where they may even feel threatened around aspects of that particular research question. So, for example, again, if it's around healthcare, where are they feeling? Where do they feel, or where are they feeling that there are challenges around aspects that pertain to their healthcare, for example? So it's understanding, and then understanding those the perspectives early on, so that by the end of a research, by the end of at least the transition questions, and leading into the sort of key questions or the main questions, is then knowing that that process, or that process should allow the investigator and the researcher to know at that point that the questions being asked and the way that the respondents or the participants are answering them should allow the data collection to be a rich data collection, so that it helps contextualize quite early on the issues, or help answer the questions, the main questions around a particular around a particular research theme. So then the key questions or the main questions. So every investigator and researcher will have a different approach around this, but in healthcare, it's absolutely important that the key questions should be around. So, for example, in a good topic guide, there could be, for example, between five and maybe 7 main themes. It might be less, and 5 to 7 themes, between 5 and 7 themes, and also depends upon how long the researcher or investigator is looking to conduct an overall interview. Now, in 45 minutes, 5 to 7 themes may be a bit challenging, but it's not impossible to get. It's not impossible to get rich data out of interviews being conducted in that context. If it's a bit longer, then it gives time as well for the participant and the respondents to answer. So generally speaking, questions should have themes, or interview or topic guides should have themes, but under each theme there should be a few questions, maybe three or four, and then generally speaking, the 3 or 4 or maybe 5 questions, and they have to be the questions have to be at the heart of the study or the investigation. So what is really the issue that sort of that has not been for example, been addressed in healthcare, for example, in an area of healthcare, what's not been addressed in area of, let's say, for example, in an area of a particular specialty of healthcare, for example. So in that context, having between 2 and 5 questions under a particular theme should look to get at the heart of the investigation or the research. And then towards the end, as the topic guide flows or the interview questions flow, there should be ending questions as well. So, for example, the ending questions should be a summary, a perception check, and is there anything else you would like to add, or what else do you think could be done or should be done, for example, in and around an area of healthcare, or around that particular healthcare specialty. So it's important to have a topic guide or interview questions with 5 main things. So you have open questions in the beginning, introductory questions, transition questions, key questions, and ending questions. So as long as the researcher and investigator develop their topic guide around that, then generally speaking is keeping everything chronological. So the next thing I want to talk about is where research, when part of when conducting interview questions, you can have questions that propagate or that encourage participants or respondents to be interpretive and answer questions in an open-ended way. But when it comes to the researcher and the investigator and how they look to how they develop the research, for example, on the one hand they want to be interpretive as well, but also have a thematic process involved. So what this means is that, like the research questions, for example, that are developed, or the topic guide, how that is developed, basically the questions themselves can be under those particular themes as mentioned, but when it comes to the actual reporting, the analysis and the reporting of that research, the investigator and research should potentially, one of the things that they should be doing or should be encouraged is having a thematic process. So basically, so for example, as I mentioned, there's five main areas where those research questions are developed as part of the preparation phase, for example, or those initial phases, and even asking the questions. But when it comes to reporting and the analysis and reporting of those questions, they won't be themed, for example, as for example introductory questions or key questions or ending questions. For example, they would be actually themed based questions against or in a line, sorry, aligned to a particular to particular areas of the main research question. So basically, when it comes to analysis and reporting, that the research is on the questions and the answers are linked to actual themes that relate to an area of specialty, for example. So so I'm going to break this down in some context, but I'm going to say this. So the thematic is basically where the experience. So in this context and an overall context is point one is experience or behavior. So what would I see you doing, for example, in relating to a sort of thematic in aligned to themes, aligned to a theme. And then another point here is opinion and value. So what do you think should have happened? So what do you think should have happened? And then point three here is how is about feelings. How did that make you feel? So generally, when participants or respondents are answering questions, generally speaking, by the time they've answered all the questions in a given interview around in and around a particular interview guide or a topic guide, what should happen is that although the themes would be different, generally speaking, from a thematic, what's referred to the apart from the research or interview questions, there's the analysis phase. The analysis, I'm not going to delve into. There is something that's referred to as thematic analysis, but I'm not going to delve into that too much in this particular workshop. But I am going to say that by the time the research questions have all been answered against a particular interview guide or a topic guide, generally speaking, what should happen is that experience and behavior perspective is identified and understood. An opinion and a value perspective is understood, and feelings and perspective around that should be understood, to the extent that overall, generally speaking, that means that if research is approached in that way, or the investigator and researcher looks to have answers from or responses from participants or respondents in that way, then in a sort of in a sort of an overview way, the questions should be answered in that sort of natural flow of things, so that actually when it comes to actual analysis or thematic analysis, for example, that all of these, the context around experience and behavior, opinion and value, and feelings have been identified, or have been contextualized, I should say. And another point, a few points I want to make around this include having sort of local knowledge, um, and then there's sensory questions as well. For example, sensory questions, and I won't delve into that too much. And then there's sort of context around context where, for example, when all the research questions have been conducted, that the investigator and the researcher the participants or respondents have been able to identify, have been able to provide or get provide or get a background to the or the research in a way that they know that from one side they're looking that they're looking to add new understanding to existing knowledge, or existing understanding that's been published, or there's and or where the participants know that the background that has been added as part of the research is trustworthy. So that's so again, this comes under part of in part relating to the sort of interview questions, but also the analysis process. So there's a few points I'm now going to make on relating to a toolbox, if you like. So basically, in this context, is knowing that these main points here relate to where all researchers, investigators looking to understand a particular topic can use this toolbox as a kind of a framework to delve into important research questions. So, for example, in the beginning or bullet point 1 is type and purpose. So under here we have things like description, structure, relationship, and contrast. Then there's themes, which relate to experience, behavior, values, feelings, and sense. And then chronological, which is to highlight that there's an intro or introduction, there's the main aspect around the research, there's a sort of an overall conclusion that can be made from the research. And then it's also important that investigators and researchers should not forget that there's rules, there's roles, there's routines, and there's perspective. So in all of those things, there is a published knowledge base around how qualitative research can be conducted and should be conducted, but it's knowing also how, at least in areas of healthcare, how investigators and researchers and even participants and respondents know that generally speaking, there are important important entities to consider to ensure that the research, the qualitative research, sort of understanding and experience has been followed through, a sort of using rules and roles or functions and rules function relating to the participant or researcher's role and function, and then the investigator, and the researchers understanding on that, and then the perspectives, as I've said. So the final point I'm going to make is really about how, hopefully, providing this overview, knowing that Re-Phew consulting is all about getting you there. So the main points here are: you will want to talk enough to clarify a research topic and communication focus. Do secondary research on topic and further focus around communication or issues. For example, I mentioned in one of the earlier slides in this workshop relating to how, for example, after conducting initial research questions or interviews, for example, there may be a point where the investigator and researcher might want to do additional research research interview questions with particular research with particular participants, and to get additional understanding from them. In and around this, then it's important to develop an interview guide or topic guide based on that effort. And then it's important to conduct at least one interview with a group member using a topic guide or an interview guide, and circular questioning. Circular question is another sort of fancy word for open-ended questions, and also any particular follow-up or sub-questioning, for example, and then ultimately being able to write up the research and to report the research based on the analysis that has been done. And there is literature, and there are sort of qualitative research books out there how to conduct research, and I'm going to read a few references following this particular understanding. But apart from that, being able to for a researcher to be able to separate themselves or from the research and from participants and respondents, so that when it comes to analysis and reporting the research, that there's a reduced or limited bias perspective. It's important that as part of the preparation of any research, that researchers and investigators look up the literature around that, look up the literature, so that can be adhered to. So in this context, writing up the research is sort of one of the final factors in and around conducting qualitative research. And so the final slide here, or part of this workshop, is just to highlight a few resources or references that investigators looking to conduct qualitative research can check out. So there's a book publication in Wiley Press, and its author Berdania Bodania and Lennart in 2020, and their work was around so you have to write a literature review, and I mentioned this in a previous workshop, and it was when looking to conduct qualitative research and understanding what's in the literature, it's important as part of the preparation phase to an extent that researchers should look to develop a literature review so that can actually hone in on the particular research question that needs to be answered, or investigators or researchers are looking to answer. So that's a publication from last year. There's a book in Open University Press by Blackster and team in 2006, which is it's quite old, but it's it's titled How to Research, and in there investigators and researchers can look to get some baseline understanding from there. There's there is a publication by Turabian in 2007, and the work is around it's a book publication by the University of Chicago Press, a manual for writers, and then there's a publication by Wallace and Ray from 2007, critical reading and writing for postgraduates and postgraduates. So there's a couple there, and there's one other one I want to read out, and then I draw this workshop to a close, and that's by Snyder in 2019, literature review as a research methodology, an overview and guidelines, and that was actually published in the Journal of Business Research in 2019. So I want to say thank you for listening on this particular workshop around qualitative research and methodology, and the next workshop will be the final workshop around this six-part Re-Phew consulting workshop series, and that will be on quantitative research. Hopefully those who are checking out the workshop can get different perspectives on different aspects around research methodology by listening in and hopefully taking notes through the different workshops that are conducted, that have been conducted through the through Re-Phew Consulting. Thank you for listening, and hopefully the next one will be conducted in due course. Okay, thank you.